I am broadcasting today from the occupied land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. The colonial project is ongoing and continues to disenfranchise First Nations people. I recognise that sovereignty has never been ceded and like to pay my respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. Always was, always will be Aboriginal lands. A few trigger warnings before speaking today. There's brief mentions of sexual violence in this event. If anyone listening needs to take a break, step away for a sec. You're encouraged to do so when you need. This is a digital festival and a recording, so you can pause, hop away, come back to this as you wish. My name is La, and I'm an able-bodied white queer person based in I am a poetry and digital editor for VoiceWorks, and I sometimes present on 3CR Community Radio. Really excited to be here with everyone today. Yeah, I might bump over to Keighley just to introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Keighley, she, her, and I'm coming to you from Awabakal country today. I'm a contemporary romance writer based in Newcastle. Mostly my speciality is in contemporary romance, a little bit of short fiction, and I've got a lot of background in festivals and the writing scene.
Hello, my name is Saraid Taylor. My pronouns are she and her, and I'm calling in from Wurundjeri country. I'm an athlete and an author, and so I'm currently with the AFLW team in the Richmond Tigers, and I'm working on my debut fiction novel.
My name is Jack Cowell. I'm a queer cis man broadcasting today from Gadigal land. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a songwriter and musician, and I'm glad to be here today. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, given this event is called the Erotic Is, we decided to start off by talking about our different definitions of what is the erotic. For me, it's very critical to open, I guess, considering the lineage of where knowledge about the erotics comes from. Most of what I and most people know in terms of writing about the erotics and sexual autonomy comes from, for me, queer Black pleasure scholars like Audre Lorde and Adrienne May Brown, from sex workers in terms of the erotic arts and extensive health information and workers' rights campaigns. I feel like I learn about fluidity from other gender nonconforming friends and about bodily autonomy from disability activists. And so it's just critical to mention that there's a big lineage from some of the information that we'll be talking about. These groups mentioned are often censored and stigmatized and excluded when discussion of the erotics comes up. But in terms of my personal definition of what the erotics is, I really like what Audre Lorde says in terms of the erotics is an internal sense of satisfaction. And that after we experience this internal sense of satisfaction, we can require no less of ourselves. Yeah, they just kind of talk about it as a source of power and information. And I really like that.
I really like that. That's like a perfect definition. I think it links back a lot to me in contemporary romance. You've got obviously the different definitions, mostly relating to like sexual love, desire, arousal, or erotic romance. But just depends on the different levels and whatnot. But basically, I think that just sums it up so beautifully. What a quote.
Back to you. I'm like still really processing that. La, you put it so perfectly in terms of just the absolute mountain of knowledge that we all climb on top of, really. It's a real privilege to be learning from so many different people. It's not necessarily a topic that I have engaged with super consciously and deeply, but when I write, it definitely comes out in different ways. And I think as I've progressed as a writer, it's interesting to explore those sort of complexities and be able to offer credit to the people that probably have had to fight so hard to make these conversations possible, I guess. It's so, sorry, Jack. I passed you and then I proceeded to keep talking, but yes, you.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, I think as, I guess, a musician and songwriter, I feel like when I think about erotic work, I definitely think about artists from the 90s and early noughties like Tori Amos and PJ Harvey, the band Hole, who kind of, I guess, kind of a similar point to Bar, really fought hard to share their erotic thoughts in in the spectrum of eroticism, like desire, lust, shameful ideas around eroticism that shouldn't be anything to be ashamed of, and sort of the message of those songs, and being like a pioneer voice to those messages during that time. And certainly as someone that is in the 30 to 40 age bracket, hearing those kind of messages on the radio and in mainstream popular culture at the time was really like awakening as a teenager to be confronted with eroticism for the first time. And when I think about writing personally about the erotic or anything around it, I always go back to kind of that first instinct or art forms that I heard.
I suppose that then takes us into, I guess, the question of who is it for? Because we touched on that a little bit through those descriptions. Like everyone, or like, to me, I guess I see this, it's for anyone, how we're talking about how it's to me it's anyone can like enjoy it, has the right to enjoy it type of thing. Yeah, because when I write, I guess I write for myself and hope the audience finds it, but yeah, for me it's like for everyone to enjoy. I feel like contemporary music or whatnot, I feel like it's like a lot of eroticism in contemporary music as well.
Yeah. I would say that much of that music is about romance or longing or desire. I mean, I read some articles recently, not so much about the erotic, but it's interesting to know that something like the dissolvement, breakup of a friendship is not like a very popular song topic to write about, but there are so many songs about the various stages of love, longing, eroticism, desire, arousal, chastity, and everything in between. And it's definitely, and I guess in nearly all art forms, an art that has been mined and plumbed, a topic that has been mined and plumbed. There's so much art around this topic, and yet it does kind of feel endless in a way, because the way that we experience the erotic, for use of a better term, personally, there doesn't seem to be that end point, I guess. I mean, I've written songs about love, and I probably will continue to write songs about love and its various stages until, a later time, I suspect, because I'm always experiencing that in new and challenging ways, I guess. And also the way that I think about those topics is different now to, say, maybe 10 years ago when I started.
I would answer that question, in a similar way, in the sense of I feel like there's two versions of the erotic, sort of more binary in the sense of who gets to experience the erotic. I feel like we all should and we all do, in varying levels of repression, I'd say, because if we look at mainstream media and the way eroticism is commodified and who it's geared towards, it isn't necessarily equal. But I would agree that in terms of expressing ourselves as artists and as writers, it is constantly changing. And so it does feel like it is just an infinite resource to mine when it comes to creating art and finding new ways to tell stories. In the same room as you all, and like we just have so much space in between. I'm like, guys, smile at me, my goodness.
Yeah, I was thinking this before. It's really quite funny in a digital event, but the access is cool.
It is really cool. Really
cool. In terms of talking about who's the erotic for, who controls the erotic, I definitely agree, Saraid, that the erotics are definitely like exist within the context of heteropatriarchal white supremacy, like in the context of folks' energy and wellness and time being taken by capitalism. It's not exactly like an equal playing field. Talking about like who gets it, like it becomes very political, who gets to experience pleasure, like how. So I guess it's a question of like prioritizing the pleasure of those most impacted by oppression. Yeah, but I also did like what you said, Jack, about when you were briefly talking about shame, because I guess it also is a task of doing any sort of work in the erotics, like decreasing any internal or projected shame or scarcity thinking. Yeah, and that's wrapped up all in what I said before also.
Yeah, there definitely is. Is around the discussion of being able to discuss eroticism, how that's accepted in society as well, of what what you can and can't say or stuff like that. Even in my genre of contemporary romance, I don't know if you noticed, but like the covers have changed, so they're now cute little cartoons. So I was like, oh, when they're really spicy, and my brain is like, no, that's meant to be nice, cute romance. So like discreet covers and everything are becoming really common, whereas I'm personally like, no, I'm not using discreet. I want people to know what I'm reading. And I feel like I used to feel like a little bit ashamed, like, oh no, I should be reading this, I should be writing this. And I don't know, I've hit that like that break point. I'm like, no, I don't care. Like, this is what I do now. Embrace it. Or if you don't, well, that's on you.
I think to that idea about shame, I mean, not so much in work, but away from my work as a songwriter, I work as a teacher, both in schools and in private music tuition. And I definitely think something that I guess over the last year or two, as I've kind of come into myself a bit more, is there's definitely an idea around having a role in society as a person, like a teacher, as an example, or there would be other occupations in that field where there's an idea about you having to be and conform to a certain image around that occupation, where your sexual identity, any erotic desire you may have, is very separate to that role or that occupation and job. And I think that it's quite tricky in this modern age because, obviously, I'm not going and speaking about my erotic thoughts with my students, or I teach primary, so definitely not at this age. But myself, I have an erotic self in my social media, in my work and my songwriting, and at times that has come into play and question in terms of my work, whether that's relevant or something that I need to post online as myself. And I still think that through someone's personal identity of their self versus that public identity of who you may be through your work. And I definitely think that people who work in some factions can feel trapped by the lessening of themselves as a person because of their role, is something kind of worth thinking about, who your day-to-day erotic self is for, or what you kind of decide to share about yourself online in a public sphere, I suppose. Does that kind of reach anyone else, or does anyone have any thoughts about that at all?
Yeah, I do, because I find it really interesting, because I so agree, and I can imagine how many different occupations, like teacher would definitely come to mind. And then if we look at sort of gender and then gender roles of people who have children themselves, like specifically women non-binary, our mothers in particular by society are absolutely restricted in that any kind of autonomy or expression, and that is not just sort of not accepted, it's really, really almost persecuted. Like, it's just such a criminal act for specifically a mother who you hope has experienced sexual pleasure to become. It's like quite an incongruent that we as society kind of just accept. And I'm not sure if I'm ever going to have children, but I'd like to think if I did, I would continue to write and continue to explore that kind of sexual identity as a sexual being. There are so many incredible writers who are breaking down barriers by continuing to explore and have those conversations when it can be so taboo. And as you say, you're, as an artist, putting yourself constantly at risk of the critique from others who don't necessarily separate from the person to the writer.
It's very interesting discussions. I'm loving it. Does anyone else have anything to add on that topic before we move on to another one? Or
yeah, I feel like I'm always stuck for words because it's in terms of who controls the erotic, it's such like as well as having these personal experiences, it's such at a systemic or institutional level that folks are either able to access like control over what makes them feel good and what they can do with their body or not. Yeah, I guess just the ad would be autonomy to make decisions to do what you want with your body. It should be a given, regardless of what you look like. Yeah, but I feel like it definitely, I didn't say before, but my main medium is poetry. both writing and performance. And I feel like pleasure as a political practice absolutely informs all of this. Yeah, so you could talk endlessly on this topic, like for instance things like abortion bans are tools created by white supremacist patriarchy to police was reproductive, like I feel like it's who controls the erotic is a huge one. But yeah, just the focus on being systemic is important, I think. Sorry, what were you saying, Joe?
I was just going to ask you, do you think that that general attitudes towards, I don't know, erotic work or eroticism or showing yourself erotic in an erotic fashion online have changed? I think the erotic has become a little bit less shocking in the last few years, and that certainly like in the time that I have existed culturally, and in the sorts of mainstream programs and things that I may have watched as a teenager, like, you know, things like the OC, for an example. I certainly think that, you know, that mainstream reactions to erotic ideas, even things like erotic acts, that may have seemed taboo. Like there was a Broad City episode around pegging or something like that. I couldn't have imagined that like 10 years ago. I'm kind of thinking, you know, from when I was exposed to eroticism through mainstream media, like the sorts of programs I watched as a teenager or books that I may have read, that I think there is a widening of acceptance about the erotic, and that I think that in the general public population, maybe things seem a bit less shameful for the general public, and people feel they can talk about things a little more boldly now, my experience.
My view is that the access to information is definitely accelerated, and that was incredibly formative for me as a young person growing up in a kind of mid-conservative area in the suburbs, being queer. That really helped. Learning about sexual health when I didn't have access to that really helped. But I would also argue, and this is experiential, just living in that the culture of violence and pursuit of bodily autonomy seems to be being about the same as historically, or if not getting worse or just evolving. And I think it also depends on where you are, because you can definitely see some spaces where there's the erotic arts like absolutely expanding and it's really joyful and interesting, and I definitely have like agree that I've seen that in the past couple of years in certain spaces. But yeah, in terms of sexual autonomy, it's like I would say maybe the culture of violence and persecution hasn't really changed, but I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on that.
I feel like I definitely see what you're saying, because I can even think like as you're speaking, I can literally think back to like the forms of media on both sides regarding how much more exposed we are nowadays as well through mass media on that. Yeah. And there was something I never really thought about, but like as we're discussing, I'm like, oh, actually.
I would agree that sort of socially, almost, particularly if you have access to communities online or in person who are more accepting of those spaces to being more sexually diverse or explorative, etc. As I was saying, like structurally, when we look at sort of like the legality side and the pushback from more powerful people, that isn't necessarily sort of like us little folk down here just trying to live happily and celebrate things, enjoy ourselves. There's a massive pushback, and that's something that I think, as we continue to try and make spaces that are safer, we can't really do that without it being on a more obviously global scale, but wherever we are, you know what I mean? Like politically, actual systemically, I think, there's a massive incongruence, and that's what I spoke about earlier. But it's interesting. It's interesting when we have these conversations about how much of it you can just agree with both sides and you just sort of explore the shades of it all, which is a depressing and optimistic thought at the same time. Like whenever there is grey, at least there is hopefully some hope in there that we cling on to.
Yeah, I guess it's a case of more visibility, but also more fascism and patriarchy. So maybe just, I don't know.
You just said that massive paragraph that I said very, very succinctly, La. That is
exactly... No. I feel like I was writing up what you said. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, so let's guide this slightly then, because it is important, I think, to acknowledge how serious this topic is. But how do we find joy then when we are creating? What's our individual personal ways that we make the erotic fun and we bring it to audiences in a way that is safe, hopefully, for us? And how do we make the world better, guys?
That's a very good question. For me, like, my speciality is happy ever afters. Like, that's cool. Formative romance is like, if you stray from that, it's like a big no-no. People read contemporary romance for happily ever afters, for that happiness. So for me, it's like just writing, but reading it. Even like watching Hallmark movies. Like, it's a lot on the sweeter side, but it's got that emotion and desire, less like of the sexual side, but like it's just that right amount that brings happiness to me, particularly Christmas Hallmark movies. I'll watch those 6 months of the year non-stop. Yeah. Anyone else have anything personal?
I mean, I think, I guess to that point about what you called like a Hallmark story or something, I mean, I think that I definitely think that maybe a couple of years ago I would have maybe shied away from wanting to write or consume those sorts of stories. Like, I would have been more interested in things that weren't so focused on having a happy ending, so to speak. But I definitely think that my personal attitudes towards enjoying and consuming that sort of work have really changed after the last couple of years. I think that there's definitely like a time and place, not even to look at it as like a guilty pleasure, but to feed yourself and your mind like something positive, or even something that is quite on the surface level, for use of a better word, because I think that it's really easy, and it's not that you shouldn't at all. I mean, I think it's both really important to engage with ideas and concepts, and even personal stories that are confronting to you and yourself. I made an album that didn't deal with sexual violence, but it dealt a lot with domestic violence in my childhood. And in writing that album and talking about it a lot in interviews, and I felt like I really revealed a big part of myself when I was both making the work and revealing it, and I felt very vulnerable and quite burnt out at the end of that experience. And I'm really glad that I shared the story, but I also kind of realized that I needed to nourish myself with something that I would call like like a Hallmark story, or something that was kind of neutral, in order for me to be able to go back into the fire, so to speak, later, to make work that dealt my own complex stories and things again. So I guess after the last couple of years, yeah, my feeling around positive stories and happily ever after and what those serve has really changed, because I felt like I got to a point where I really needed to watch a couple of happily ever afters in my life. To kind of normalize things out.
In terms of talking about how eroticism's dealt with in our respective practices, I was doing a bit of brainstorming about like how I actually go about day to day, but I realized I actually have a whole lot of kind of an archival practice to do with erotic, gathering like erotic research for my work. Like, for instance, I've mapped out like big archives of different dreams I would have, or different like visions you would have from masturbating, or I like work with voice memos and conversation with friends, or huge cut and paste mind maps, or even both have an appreciation and engage with correspondence. I really love, I guess in short, it's people's erotic letters, or if you're talking about love instead of eroticism, like love letters. I think correspondence is really cool. I have a few like email pen pals that I kind of send sexy emails to here and there, like and by that I just mean like sharing poems with each other, or I think all of these little just practices inform like a bigger archival thing. And I think and I'd be curious to see it builds up archives of this, whether it's like journaling or because I feel like that definitely informs a writing practice.
Yeah, interesting, La. I feel like I'm quite a sentimental person, which I think a lot of writers would suffer from. And if like, yeah, if that doesn't sort of force us to try and preserve things or create new things out of experiences, yeah, I'm not sure what does. But in terms of correspondence, I particularly love letters that we sort of send to each other, like other people send to each other, that I'm sending to other people as well, and I'm not going through other people's mail, I would just like to say. Text messages, I find that sort of the virtual way that we now move through and express love and eroticism is really interesting. I think that continues to change really quickly and has changed a lot, and like the sort of the ironic space and that online brings us, like there's a lot of intimacy even though there is such physical distance, which I feel like is basically this conversation today, us talking about such sensitive emotional topics whilst not in the same room, engaging each other in a way that is very, very virtual, just through small screen, but we create a different dialogue that wouldn't exist in the same way if we were together. So yeah, I'm interested in the way that interacts with each other erotically and non-erotically. And I think we spoke about when we describe what is erotic, necessarily lustful and physical all the time. Like children experience a very, very innocent form of eroticism that is more just fantasy and more just love and enjoyment, especially I think probably through movies, Hallmark movies that are much more gentler and innocent. I think that it helps form our kind of initial relief, but we then like more physical expressions of lust and eroticism.
Yeah, I definitely like that. Then you can even link that into like young adult books and stuff like that, where I guess in like a lot of books it's romance usually a concept of some form, even though it's not like the plot of it, but how you had like that sweeter side. I never even processed that you said that, like from like Hallmark movies or like even like High School Musical and stuff like that. I'm having flashbacks to now. I'm gonna say it's like a gateway to it, but I'm just like, oh, now I think about it, because then I started going into like the more like spicier ones, and then obviously you keep going. But yeah,
I like interesting how that sort of really fundamental urge is manifest in different mediums, obviously, but also tiers within those mediums. Like it's very placid at the beginning, but you can sort of see the germinal like impulse really of that, the beginnings of like lust, and then how it goes and is more serious. Which you can question all the definitions of all of it anyway. Like, what is innocence? What is gentle, placid love versus something more? But yeah, it's interesting to be having and like sort of engaging in those different concepts, challenging them.
Does everyone have maybe like a first text using the wide text? Doesn't necessarily have to be a book or a short story of something that they remembered kind of discovering the erotic, whether they were aware of that or not. For me personally, I think reading Jeffrey Eugenides' The Virgin Suicide is definitely like a text, and then seeing the film by Sofia Coppola was definitely something that I remember thinking about the darker side of eroticism for the first time, and also the way that erotic desire is kind of presented as like a hope and like a fantasy, and then kind of taken away and changed in that film and that text is really interesting, and something that I think back on, probably because it was my first introduction to the duality of eroticism, I would say.
Yeah, like for me, I remember picking up Confess by Colin Hoover way before being BookTok famous. This was like 8 years ago. It was like my first like spicy romance. I was like, oh, am I meant to be reading this? It's something if my mum knew I was reading, I would not be allowed to read. So then I just kind of started slightly growing my collection from there. But I distinctly remember that book as always being like my first introduction into eroticism.
We've seen of people sort of putting together a montage of all of like the cartoon characters that are essentially their sexual awakening. And I always find them so amusing because same, everybody, like it's so true when I think back how little I was and how young, and how obviously Disney has all its own sort of problematic layers, but I was so attracted to characters like Tarzan. Like I was obsessed with Tarzan. I was obsessed with Aladdin. I'm like, what is it? What will that say about me? But there was definitely like, without me being able to actually recognize it at that age, that was the base of some kind of like deeper level of desire. And I think it's really, obviously that's kids shows designed for kids made by adults. I think it's interesting the way adults essentially who are creating this art are tapping into that commerciality of eroticism in a way that would never ever really be talked about, because it's not necessarily appropriate for children to be thought of in that way, but it sells and people buy it and it makes money. So like the erotic is really threaded through all of our layers of society. Fascinating. Go Tarzan. That's all I'll say.
After you were saying, I was just thinking, I can't exactly pinpoint one for me myself, but from what you're saying, it's why it's so important to have respect and care for childhood or teen sexuality. And I was also thinking about how much Christian theology informs governance in this country, particularly. Like that's intermixed with white supremacy, but there's like the curricula is so informed by politics, and that includes sexual health education. Just obviously very important to respect kids.
Yeah, as you say, deeper issues, right? Because when we talk education, and it goes back to visibility and representation as well, you want to be influencing children in the right way. And I don't say the right binary way, but more there is opportunity to explore, and it's not necessarily like, it's just such a great use of such a powerful tool for control. When you think of all of those kids movies and our media in general we grow up with and we sort of are brought up on, if we don't sort of push back against those messages, it comes in very insidious ways that are hard to untangle later on in life. It's all built on the same thing, Laura. All of the conversation as we come back to the same points, that the erotic is so important, and it's also so controlled. Even when we feel like we're breaking certain barriers down, it's built on such a foundation that is so strong. It's hard to really ultimately change much of it.
Yeah, but whilst I have been pushing that a lot, I would also say that there's such a huge history of like joy and queer and trans liberation in the terms of talking about sexual autonomy too, which is really cool to refer to. Yeah, or at least I try to remind myself of that. Yeah, and it's so active right now too.
Laura, I have a question for you. How could the erotic be used in our writing or creative, or in your writing and creative practice? And do you think that one has to write erotica in some form in order to use or benefit from the erotic? Is that relevant to you and your practice at all?
Oh, and the second question, I definitely think you don't need to be writing to enjoy any sort of erotica. And could you repeat that first question, sorry?
Yeah, sure. I wanted to know how the erotic is used in your writing or creative practice. How if at all?
Well, I feel like I'm still such a baby, like scholar of pleasure or pleasure activist. It's all kind of what I was talking about before in terms of making big digital archives. I really enjoy collaborative writing work in terms of talking about the erotica, like things like zines and zine distros, and feel like I get so much information from communities making zines. Yeah, I really love them. I would say I'm still in this stage of tinkering in terms of sharing erotica and sharing poetry. But yeah, I really love that community-based practice stuff. Like that's where I get a lot of my joy. Yeah. What about everyone else?
Yeah, I agree with what you said. I don't think you have to write erotica to enjoy it by any means. I guess for my practice as well, it's more to assist with the narrative, storyline, the character developments, just trying to balance, I guess, the emotional side, that's all I've got for you. Like, it's just that balance. Like, I definitely like more, I've written a lot of more sweet romance and only just starting to go more into the spicy stuff. But I think I can't just write 1,000 words of sex. If you're going to write about it, it's got to like accompany it in terms of contemporary romance. it needs to assist the story. You can tell, like, if you read it, that's just been thrown in there. It just doesn't work, if that makes sense. For me, it's finding that balance that it's assisting the narrative. Yeah. What about you, Saraid?
That's an interesting question. Jack, do you have any thoughts? Provide me some time while I try and think more about that and come up with something to say.
I think I think the same as the other two speakers. I don't think you need to write erotica in order to enjoy it. And it's not, but I mean, it is been writing about relationships and their different forms of something that is relevant to my practice. I'm kind of writing, I'm in the process at the moment of writing a record that is about 8 different kinds of relationships, and some of those relationships are like a one night stand, a long term relationship, quite a desire. There's a relationship that I had with an older man when I was a teenager that I now think of differently, that I'm around the same age as them, that I now think of as a predatory relationship. And I guess, thinking about how relationships change as well. I mean, there's a song about a friendship on that, and sometimes friendships can also be confusingly erotic in some way. Like there is a certain love for a friend that could be construed as some kind of desire, I guess. What do I? So yeah, I think the erotic is, I guess, I was going to say unless you work in the tax department, maybe eroticism is relevant to a lot of different sorts of practices. But maybe even tax could be to some. I'm not going to rule that out for them. But yeah, I think I definitely, we've talked a lot today about and eroticism and different shades of eroticism, and what that is on the spectrum. I mean, you were talking about sweet romance versus spicy romance before, and they're clearly like really 2 different shades. But yeah, I think I feel like I point myself personally where I don't feel shame around a lot of my erotic thoughts or ideas that I have personally anymore, and I kind of wanted to go on an erotic journey personally over the last year where I really challenged myself not to feel shame or be ashamed about aspects of my body or my desire or my thought or whatever that was, and to try to normalize that by having conversations with like-minded friends in closed circles. So yeah, and that has kind of informed, I suppose, my songwriting and how I feel about writing about some of those erotic stories, all which have different varying pressure points and ideas. So yeah, that's a bit about my practice and my thoughts on the erotic personally.
It's interesting. I feel like that segues relatively neatly into how you find the interaction of when that art is created, so your songwriting, or like Keighley with your novel writing, like people that was it a process for you becoming more comfortable with people, reading stuff that is, like, people would assume is quite intimate because in some way it's your fantasies that you're putting onto the page into a melody?
Yeah, I think for me it's difficult because I chose to write under my real name rather than a pseudonym, where a lot of romance writers will use a pseudonym. The time I was like, no, I think I was writing like way paranormal stuff. Then I went into sweet romance, and I never had the confidence to do like spicy romance. It wasn't until like this last year that I actually got the confidence, because I started reading dark romance. And just reading this one book changed my entire perspective. I just went, the stuff that I was too afraid to write, I no longer had that fear of. So I've just kind of just like been working on embracing it. Don't think any of my family's read my spicy stuff yet. I do recall a short story I wrote once where my dad was like, where did you write that? And I was just sitting here going, that's like really innocent. What's happening? I did have one friend read my most recent piece though, because I just really wasn't sure how it went. And she had the reaction of, Keighley wrote this. Then Keighley wrote this. And I'm like, oh, so mixed reaction there. I'm interested to see how else other people take it. But I pretty much, like, to my bosses at work, I'm like, you're not allowed to read this one. Like, there's certain people I feel like probably shouldn't read if you're not comfortable with seeing me in that type of light. So yeah, I think I've hit that point that I'm happy to embrace it But I'm also really lucky to be supported like really well in the romance community as well. We all like support each other really nicely. So
What about you, Jack?
Well, my work isn't strongly erotic. I mean, I would say it's personal in terms of the stories that I've told around my family, which I've spoken about publicly. So quite big publications and things. I definitely question how that would affect the people involved, but I guess I kind of ultimately feel that if you whatever the topic is, I mean, I guess this is a non-erotic specific answer, but I think that if you feel that you are just in what you have to say publicly and that you've thought about how others may react to that work in relation to you, um, then I didn't feel any shame in sharing my stories. Yeah, mine were mainly around domestic violence. I did have one song kind of about like transfiguring into like a werewolf that was like erotic, I suppose, that kind of played with the desire of like carnal desire. But yeah, for me personally, I wasn't bothered by what other people thought of me or the work. I felt like the work was quite strong, and I felt like I was strong enough to stand by what I had to say as well. So yeah, my family did have a problem with my work. I didn't care, I guess. So that's.
what about you, Saraid?
It's funny. So I have only really started having short fiction and poetry published really this year. It was a very, very slow, quiet year last year. Very loud rejections, but very slow and quiet in any other way. And this year has been a little bit more successful. So I'm in the process of navigating having loved ones read my work for the first time. And it is interesting. I think in terms of the separation of the person and the artist, confronting my parents, etc. But I think by the time my novel is published, I will be having the conversation of if you don't necessarily want to be like it, the novel is not about, but obviously I'm still a writer, so if you're not going to be able to differentiate, then maybe it's not something that you should read. Yeah, it's an interesting conversation, I think, to have. I think like just even the conversation about entitlement with the audience and the creator, what the creator owes the audience and what the audience owes the creator, vice versa. I think that's one that can tie in erotic as well. Like I think there's a push-pull in that within that dialogue and context as well. But yeah, to answer your question, it's still occurring, it's still sort of happening. But I think I'm leaning into it. I used to absolutely despise the idea of it. The absolute idea, not even necessarily like romance writing or anything overly lustful, but just writing itself. So it's a really freeing process to be able to let's read and interpret how.
I definitely get that because having worked in the arts, I've done like anthologies and stuff like that. And whenever I read a piece, I'm like, oh, I get so in depth. I'm like, but is that about the author? I know it's not from experience with myself. Like having met authors, I know they are very different, and I can separate them from their work. I can love them like as both the individual and as the creator, which I think is like fascinating. But I feel like sometimes there's that fear of, will people separate that, or will they judge you for something you've written? Because, like, you know, writing, it might not necessarily be your views. Like for me personally, I sometimes put something I don't agree with in my work, but because I feel it's for the character, and I don't want the character. People go, "Oh, the book's about you." It's not. I might like put a slither of something of me in each work, but not. No way am I going to have just it's about me. No way. Yeah, so I think it's very interesting.
Everyone, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I have to say adieu. Thank you so much for having me this evening, and I look forward to watching the end of the conversation sometime soon. Thank you so much. Have a lovely evening.
And I can't wait, genuinely, can't wait to read your work, both of you. It sounds really fascinating. So different, I feel like all four of us are really, really sort of different medium/as approaches, but yeah, cool. Interacting in different ways with that sort of the deeper, the deeper concepts of eroticism. I'm still not sure. Like, I feel like I walk away and that's what I take from this, that the eroticism is just so much up for interpretation, and that's probably
it's something we're going to talk about for ages.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah, for sure.
Goodbye, and go check out the rest of the National Young Writers Festival program. I'm very excited for the in real life events, the huge digital program that the brilliant Jess has helped coordinate or has coordinated. Yeah, and I'm just grateful to be here with all of you tonight. Thanks.
Bye.